Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Jess Moyer. I'm a strategist here at Frameworks. We are so excited to, in partnership with Leading for Kids, to be able to share a framing strategy with you today. This strategy has been a long time in the making. It reflects multiple years of research process that we've engaged in. I want to say a couple thank yous at the outset. I won't be able to name everyone who has contributed to this massive effort, but I do want to acknowledge lots of researchers on our team contributed to this. I also want to give a shout out to our comms team here at Frameworks who have done an incredible job putting this event together. And we've got some comms folks behind the scenes today who are keeping everything running smoothly. This work would not have been possible without support from the Children's Hospital Association and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And we're really fortunate to have our program officer from RWJF, Jeanette Elstein, with us today. You'll hear from her in just a little bit. We've also got two other esteemed guests with us, Marquita Little Newman and Tara Watson, who both serve as project advisors, and they have graciously agreed to come along as well and share their perspectives from the field. We're so grateful to have them with us. So the bulk of our time today will actually be dedicated to discussion. We'll have a panel discussion, which I'm really looking forward to. And we are fortunate to have John Gompertz here, who is a friend and collaborator of both Frameworks and Leading for Kids. So he's agreed to moderate the discussion. You'll hear from him too in just a minute. I'll let him introduce himself. And finally, I want to recognize and thank our close partner and kind of co-conspirator in this work, David Alexander, who is the president of Leading for Kids. I know lots of you on this call probably know him already. I have really enjoyed getting to know David over the time that we've been working together. I appreciate his good humor, his open-mindedness, his really sharp social analysis, and especially his unwavering dedication to improving the lives of children and families. So with that, I will say welcome to all of you. Thanks for being here. And I'm going to turn things over to David now to offer his own welcome.
Great. Thank you all for being here today. And thank you to the team at Frameworks for sticking with this project. We jokingly say that this is now the fourth year of an 18-month project, which is actually true. And there's some good reasons for that, but Frameworks has been brilliant throughout this whole time. So thank you for all of that. So Jess may have mentioned that I'm a pediatrician. I'm not only a pediatrician, I'm an old pediatrician. I've been around this space for a long time. I finished my pediatric training 43 years ago. And I started Leading for Kids in 2018 because of a question I've been thinking about for a long time. You know, in the 40 plus years that I've been a pediatrician, there have been incredible strides made in the healthcare of children. The most common reason that kids were admitted to the hospital when I trained were infections from a bacteria that most people training in pediatrics today have never seen because we've developed a vaccine for it. When I trained, it was very unusual to see an adolescent with cystic fibrosis because kids died before their adolescence. And today, there are more adults than children with cystic fibrosis. So we've made incredible strides in healthcare of children. But if you look at health defined more broadly, health and well-being, American kids are just not doing so well. And we have just not made the kind of strides in the well-being of children that we have in the health of children. And there's this real paradox in America. You know, on the one hand, Americans love their kids and will do anything they can for their kids or their neighbors' kids or their grandkids. And we have a large, very robust community of kids advocacy organizations who do work and speak out every day on behalf of kids. But despite the love that Americans have for kids, and despite the work of all of us as advocates, we really haven't moved the needle on the big issues that drive the well-being of kids: poverty, hunger, housing. These are issues that we just have not made the kinds of strides with that we might have. And for a long time, I've wondered why. And Leading for Kids was established to try to understand what is it about American culture that allows us to not make the kind of progress, to not center kids in our policy decisions that we in ways that we might. So in 2019, as Jess mentioned, with funding from the Children's Hospital Association and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we started this project to try to understand the deep cultural mindsets that drive the way Americans think and act about kids, and to try to come up with a new narrative, a new way of talking about kids. Now, today, if you look at kids advocacy in America, there are really three ways that we as advocates talk about kids. If we think that kids should get something, why kids should get whatever the thing is, we use one of three ways of talking about it. Kids should get help because A, it's the moral, just thing to do. We should do it because it's the right thing to do. We sometimes say kids should get something because they're vulnerable and we need to do this for them and protect them. Or we sometimes say that kids need to get things because it's a good investment. That's something that we've used a lot over the last few years. It's a good investment to do things for kids. And those arguments resonate with me, probably resonate with many of you. That's what brought me to the party. But those are the arguments we've been making, and it's only gotten us so far. So this work that we set out to do is to try to come up with some new ways of talking, a new narrative to talk about why kids should get the things that we all know that they need to thrive. So with that, I'm going to turn this to my friend John Goppertz, who's going to lead us through a discussion of kind of what we found after 4 years of research.
Thank you, David. It's great to be with all of you today. I have to say this is a topic near and dear to my heart. It's also, I should note, an exceptionally difficult task that we've set ourselves to. You know, I was lucky enough to be part of the team that launched America's Promise back in 1997, and we had all the living presidents and General Colin Powell, who was the most popular man in the country at that time. So a pretty amazing assortment of power and influence. And our point was to change the conversation, to make children and young people a higher priority in our policy, in our culture, in our communities, and in our own personal behavior. And for all our good work, here we are in 2024, continuing to have this conversation. How do we make children a more central consideration, a higher priority in decision making? I'm so glad that David and Leading for Kids and Frameworks are tackling this subject, and I'm personally heartened by the ideas you'll hear today. In a second, I'm going to ask Jess, we're going to go back to Jess, and I'm going to ask her to lay out Framework's key findings, and then we'll invite our guests to comment. You'll hear from those guests shortly, but let me introduce them to you now quickly. So we're joined by Marquita Little-Newman, who's the Executive Director of the Partnership for America's Children, Jeanette Elstein, who's a Program Officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, as you heard, and Tara Watson, who is a Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute and the Director of the Brookings Center for Economic Security and Opportunity. Thank you all for joining today, and we're going to get into this conversation in just a few moments. If all of you who are listening have questions, please post them in the Q&A box, and I'm told you even have an opportunity to upvote questions that you like a lot, and hope that somebody else has posted, but you hope will get answered. I promise we'll try to get to your questions, but I also recognize that we have a very short time today and a lot of material to cover. So if we don't get to your question, I hope you'll reach out directly to David. Here I am offering David's email. Reach out directly to David to continue the conversation. We're putting David's email in the chat, and for those who'd like to connect with him, please do so. Now, to get us rolling and into the substance here, let's turn back to Jess to lay out Framework's findings. Jess?
Thanks, John. So yeah, I'm going to provide an overview of the framing strategy here. I have to say we could spend many days together talking through the strategy, so it is going to be kind of a bit of a whirlwind, but hopefully you get the nuts and bolts here, you get the gist of it, and you're intrigued enough that you walk away with some resources and do some more exploration on your own, and also stay in touch. We want to keep the conversation going. So it's that challenge that David described, this just basically the idea that kids in the US aren't thriving the way that we would hope and expect. Outcomes aren't what we want them to be. That was the sort of impetus for taking on this, like John said, very ambitious project from the start. And here at Frameworks, the kind of research we do involves, we do deep exploration of the relationship between culture and communication. We're not going to get into the details of our research process and methods, although we can drop a link to the research report with all of those details in it in the chat, and I encourage you to check it out and read through that yourself. But just to give you an idea of some of the kinds of questions that we were interested in, it was things like, are there aspects of the way that we think and talk as a culture that are getting in the way of us setting that policy agenda that we know we need? Do the different mindsets that we hold either facilitate or impede positive social change? And importantly, a big one, how can we, as advocates for kids, advocates for social change, how can we shift our own thinking and our own communications to advance a new, more productive narrative? So what we're sharing here today are some of the answers to those questions, and particularly to that last one. We want to talk through some key shifts that we can make in how we think and talk that we know have proven potential to make tangible, meaningful change. Some of the changes that we know this framing strategy can help bring about are things like, for example, raising the salience of kids within kind of our policymaking arena. It can help increase our shared sense of responsibility as a society, all of us together, to better care for kids. And it can also boost our sense of what we often refer to as collective efficacy, basically our shared sense that it's within our power. We have the capacity together to meet pressing challenges and implement solutions and create the needed change. So I do want to share one specific really key finding from the research before diving into the strategy itself. I think it's important as a way to set up the strategy. It's something we discovered really early on in the research process. As it turns out, it isn't necessarily how we, as a culture, think about kids themselves per se that hinders our ability to implement a policy agenda that would improve the lives of kids. It's actually more how we think about other closely related topics that often gets in the way. So, for example, how we think about adults and the personal responsibility that adults bear, how we think about race, how we think about government, the role of government, and importantly, how we think about care and caregiving, how we understand those issues. Mindsets about these other topics get easily activated when we're talking about kids. So it means as communicators, we have to contend with them. We have to understand that landscape. So the concepts of care and caregiving specifically were not our focus at the outset of this project, but we really quickly realized that we would have to engage directly with them. Here's why that is. Basically, when we as a culture, when we think about kids and what kids need to thrive, there's one central idea that kind of thoroughly occupies the public mind. It's the fact that above all else, what kids need is love and care. If they have that, they'll be okay. If they don't have it, the outlook is pretty grim. None of us would argue with that idea. I think we all believe in our hearts and know children need love and care above all else. It's a fundamental truth, a universally agreed upon fact. At the same time, our kind of cultural preoccupation with love and care is often so consuming that it's actually hard to make space within the public discourse for talking about other things. And there actually are other things in addition to that that we need to be thinking and talking about too. So after much frame development and testing, we were able to identify that actually the most effective way to bring those other influences and factors and variables that impact kids into the conversation is to lean into that dominant focus on care, not to kind of try to pull the focus away from it, but to lean into it and to kind of just stretch how we conceptualize care itself, to expand our definition of what constitutes care. And that's exactly what the framing strategy does. It expands our collective thinking about what kids need to thrive. It does it through 3 overarching shifts, and I'll talk through each of those 3 shifts, but they're all shifts in how we think and talk about, and ultimately how we define the concept of care. Okay, so shift number one, we need to move away from an exclusively interpersonal understanding of care. So one that defines care in terms of direct interactions between individual adults and individual children. And we want to move instead towards a much broader understanding of care that encompasses a wide range of different people and relationships and roles and responsibilities. The idea is to come to an understanding of care as a shared endeavor, something that involves multiple coordinated actions, and something that all of us together as members of a society do. So this shift is important because right now, responsibility for kids tends to be viewed through a really narrow lens of individualism. It's individual families themselves, most of all individual parents, who are expected to be the sole providers of absolutely everything their children need to do well. And that's regardless of social political circumstances, the surrounding environment, availability of resources, policies, supports, infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. All of that stuff kind of falls out of the public mind because this individualism mindset is so strong. And what it means is that parents tend to be either celebrated and praised when their kids do well, but sadly, much more often, parents are harshly judged and scorned and blamed for any negative outcomes that their children experience. So that first recommendation is about widening our lens beyond interpersonal caregiving to bring that broader social context into view. We're all caregivers in a sense, in that we all are part of decision-making about how we shape our society, and that those collective decisions we make together have implications for kids. So we're all caregivers. Caregiving is a collective endeavor. Okay, a second cultural shift that's needed in terms of how we think and talk about care involves countering harmful patterns in thinking about the sort of relative deservingness of particular families or communities to receive collective care. We need to move away from ideas about deservingness and instead toward a shared recognition that actually the need for collective care is a universal need. So we all have a responsibility to provide it to everyone and make sure we're meeting that essential need for every child in every community. This shift is needed because questions of deservingness are really pervasive within public thinking. Our research shows they're also often rooted in harmful or sometimes even dehumanizing mindsets about inherent group differences, especially when it comes to race. I mentioned that individual parents are often blamed for the negative outcomes that their own children experience, largely because those social, structural, kind of systemic factors that impact outcomes for kids tend to remain outside the public view. As an extension of that phenomenon is the fact that people of color are often unjustly blamed for the disproportionately negative outcomes their communities experience compared to white communities. Essentially, the structural causes of disparities, right? So things like neighborhood disinvestment, lack of green space, underfunded schools, et cetera. Basically, structural racism. Structural racism is largely off the public radar. And so the very existence of racial disparities is all too often interpreted as a negative reflection on the choices, the behaviors, sometimes even the values of people of color themselves. A really toxic, harmful pattern in public thinking that we need to shift. So the second recommendation is to shift the focus away from the recipients of care altogether toward a focus on our shared responsibility as collective caregivers to make sure that we're providing care universally, and also to be thinking about where our delivery of care is uneven, where we need to be ramping up our provision of care in communities where it's maybe currently lacking. Okay, third and final shift is we need to move away from a compartmentalized understanding of quote unquote children's issues. Right now, we tend to think of kids' issues as just those that kind of either speak to direct caregivers, like they reference parents or teachers, or ones that pertain to what happens within households or maybe at school. Those are the only kinds of policies that are really appreciated as having an impact in the lives of kids. But we need to move towards an understanding that all of the different kinds of decisions we make as a society hold implications for kids. And they all therefore constitute collective caregiving. So this shift is important because we, again, as a culture, we harbor a fair amount of skepticism and distrust when it comes to the role of government. Multiple unhelpful mindsets exist about government being inept or inefficient, even corrupt. And these mindsets lead us to want to just kind of minimize the role of government or even get government out of the way altogether. That's obviously a challenge for those of us who want to advocate for better policies, better public services, programs, et cetera. But what works by reframing specific policies themselves as forms of caregiving for kids, a thing which we know the public already holds as essential, we can actually increase support for needed government action. We can increase government accountability, and we can build the public sense that we should expect our public institutions, our agencies, our elected officials to be responsive to the needs of children. So that's the third and final recommendation, is to help convey that collective caregiving is expansive. It happens everywhere, through every issue, every decision, every policy we make. And it should be a consideration throughout all of the decision we engage in as a society. So those are the 3 shifts. I know that was a really fast tour. I'll just say quickly that obviously what I've laid out is a really high-level framing strategy rather than a set of specific to-dos or kind of communications tactics. 2 quick things about that. 1, we do offer some more tactical tips and suggested framing moves in our strategic brief, which we can drop a link to in the chat. And the other thing is that it's also kind of by design that what we're offering is a new general direction of travel rather than specific GPS coordinates. Forgive the metaphor. We at Frameworks love the explanatory metaphor. But the idea is that a framing strategy is not a messaging strategy, right? It's not a set of specific talking points. It's not a tagline. It's a general guide that can be flexed in lots of different ways for different messengers, different audiences, different formats, different contexts, et cetera. It's a way for us to align our communications in a sense and increase one another's impact, but also be able to maintain our own respective areas of focus, our own particular audiences, our own short-term objectives, our own specific policy goals. So the hope here is that this strategy offers something to each one of you that you can take away and find useful, and that it is designed to be broadly applicable. Okay, and with that, I'll hand it back to you, John.
Thanks, Jess. Terrific. And Jess is right. There's a lot of material there. And we're giving you a little bit, I would say, an introduction to this. And I hope we have many more opportunities to talk with many of you about these ideas. Not surprisingly, I've got a bunch of questions, but we're also going to try to keep this conversation pretty free-flowing among our guests today. That said, I'm going to start with Marquita, but before we dig in, Marquita, can you just say a little itty-bitty bit about the Partnership for America's Children?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. So glad to talk with you all today about this really important topic. As John said, I'm here representing the Partnership for America's Children. Some of you may know our predecessor organization and be familiar with our work. We were once Voices for America's Children, but the partnership is a national organization that supports and represents a network of state and local child advocates. So our mission is to engage, empower, and invest in this network of local and state advocates. And we represent advocates who are doing work across 38 states and 48 different organizations.
Awesome. Awesome. So just to relocate us, Marquita, I want to ask you about the first field perspective that Jess talked about. Remember, the big idea is that care is collective, that we need to move away from thinking about caring for kids as the sole and private responsibility of individual families and think more about caring for kids as a societal responsibility that all of us share. Okay, so you work with your network of organizations, your coalitions around the country, and I wonder how and why a framing like this, moving towards a collective care mindset, could help the messaging of your coalitions.
Absolutely. So first I would point out that really our network and the work that they do, most are multi-issue child advocacy organizations. And so they are working on policy issues that are across the broad spectrum of areas that impact children and their families. I think that one of the most urgent issues that they are trying to respond to as they're doing the great advocacy work that they do, and they're at state capitals across the country and local council meetings. One of the biggest challenges that they're currently navigating that relate to this idea of collective caregiving, or this lack of embracing of that concept, is really navigating the very fractured and polarized political environment that advocates are dealing with, that is much different than some of the challenges that we've seen in the past. Children's issues have historically been a rallying point for bipartisan collaboration and support for bringing a number of different allies and perspectives to the table. But I think there are two really core beliefs that are underneath kind of this polarization, and we especially see this in the states that where we have members who are in more conservative policy environments. This notion of personal responsibility and individual parental rights. And so regardless of the issue, whether advocates are working on, education issues that impact children, like access to high quality, affordable childcare, or whether they are working on health issues like all children having access to adequate health care, there are really these core ideas that very much as we heard, this framing around the individual parent's responsibility and individual parent choices and decisions sort of being more important than broader societal needs, and this notion that it is really an individual family, personal responsibility, their values, their decisions that are kind of driving the experiences that their children may be having, whether they have the resources and things that they need to thrive. And so, this notion of collective caregiving and moving away from sort of this interpersonal dynamic offers a reframe, I think, for advocates as they're framing these issues and having these questions, addressing these questions. I think it really begs the question and allows advocates to enter the space to pose the question, kind of, what type of future or society are we building, and do we imagine for all children? And so it shifts it away from what individual decisions our parents are making, what individual actions families might have taken, to really thinking more broadly about this buying into building a better society for us all. And then it kind of becomes a shared responsibility, I think, and it opens the door for advocates to have these broader conversations.
So I talk for a second about this opening the door. When we talked earlier, you said, maybe this unlocks, it creates a little openness to consider things that people hadn't otherwise considered, which is exactly what we're looking for. It doesn't, a frame doesn't determine what the policy outcome necessarily is, but it does really influence what you get to talk about and whether people are willing to engage on that. So if you could say a little bit more about creating some openness to conversation, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate your highlighting that it doesn't necessarily get you to the policy solution. And in fact, I would be I'm a supporter and encourage, as an advocate, even for advocates to not necessarily be the folks who are coming up with the policy solutions, but it's really about broadening the table and being able to invite a diverse set of voices to the table. And so that's what this framing allows for. It really broadens that advocacy base. And so you get the parents who may be on different sides of the spectrum politically, who may have different individualized family values. I think as you make this a conversation about societal impact, you bring educators to the table, you bring healthcare providers, you bring the faith-based community. I think it allows for deeper exploration of what are the things that concern parents and families, caregivers today. What are the challenges and barriers that they're navigating? And it allows for a deeper exploration of potential policy issues when you have more people at that table, and you're creating more child change as you broaden that advocacy base.
That's great. Tara and Jeanette, I'm going to come to you to lead on the other two, but I just want to get any reflections that you have on this notion of moving towards a view of collective caregiving, not displacing. We should be really, really clear. Nobody's for displacing families or even reducing the responsibility and opportunities of families. This is this is additive. The theory is this actually helps families, as we've all probably experienced one way or another. When folks help your kids, that helps you. So Tara, any thoughts on this notion of collective caregiving?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really powerful about it is that as an economist, we often sort of separate things into the economic sphere and the family sphere, and our policies follow from that separation. And by having this new framing, I think it allows us to really recognize that those are not two distinct spheres. They are, in fact, they operate together, and that economic decision-making impacts children and families, and that what children and families do has big economic implications. And so I think really, it really helps us to avoid that that siloization, if that's a word, of these two different spheres of thinking about policy and about the way the world operates.
Awesome. Jeanette?
Picking up on a few things that Tara and Marquita just spoke about.
I saw you taking notes there.
I
know.
Folks know me. I like listen. I have to listen with my hands. But so I'm a program officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation on our Healthy Children and Families portfolio, and one key area of our work is how do we support a strong policy ecosystem to advance care as a vital public good. Often it is seen as sort of the private realm of families, and how do we sort of demonstrate that care is vital to the well-being of all of society. And so I definitely see this framing strategy in supporting that policy ecosystem. We don't do as much of the advocacy, but we support it.
Yep.
And this piece around connecting the economy to children and families, we're actively working to support building some of those connections between advocates, but also building the strength of that ecosystem to bring families, caregivers, parents, to lead the setting of those policy agendas based on their experiences. We have also, make sure we support a strong organizing ecosystem. And so just so much of what you both said resonates a lot.
Well, Jeanette, let's stay with you. And there's been some really good questions and some plus up voting on questions around the next part of this conversation. So the second big idea emerging from the framework's research is that care must be inclusive, that we need to counter racist stereotypes and pathologizing tendencies that call into question the deservingness of certain families, often families from low-income communities or Black and brown families. And instead, we need to cultivate an understanding of the need for collective care is actually universal, even if we struggle with satisfying that entirely in our policies and in our practices. So you all are focused on advancing equity and justice for all young people and their families. It's at the heart of what you do. So I'm really interested to get your reaction. So often we get this question in framing and messaging conversations. Should it be universal or should it be targeted? Universal can seem like some pretty weak sauce and sort of cliche ridden, and targeted risks pathologizing some kids and some families and some communities. So tell us how you think about this idea that care must be inclusive.
Thank you, John, for this question. And you're right, this is at the heart of what we do, and I'm jazzed to respond to this.
Fantastic.
So something that I'm proud of is that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has been more explicit about focusing on addressing and dismantling structural racism as a key barrier to health equity. And that is very true to what we do on Healthy Children and Families. And we're working towards a social contract that acknowledges our collective accountability to children and families. So this is very key to what we do.
Absolutely.
And I think it is important to name that there have been, to name the explicit anti-Blackness, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism that pathologizes or blames individual families that are of those identities, and obscures the systems and structures and the systems of oppression that have been historical and are rooted in our country's founding. And we started off this country as treating children as property and women as chattel, and this has led us to undervalue caregiving. And I think I was reading through the guidance, the framing guidance, and I think one thing that we've been really careful about is naming these systems of oppression and how those translate into these systems, but not saying that we want to just expand who is seen as deserving. We want to actually just remove that thought process from the equation.
Yep.
And something that I really appreciated from the framing guidance was that it's important to think about the outcomes that we're seeking, which is that all children and families have the resources they need to have well-being. But the process needed to get there needs to be, aware of that historical and current context and those systems of oppression. So the process needed to get there needs to acknowledge that we have not cared for children and families evenly. And so I think that naming those systems, naming that I just think the framing can help create space for reparative policies that redress historical and current harm. A lot of the organizations that we work with are advocating for reparative policies as big as reparations, like baby bonds, like guaranteed income, and that needs to acknowledge that history. So I'm excited for what this could create space for.
I'm interested that we've got a little theme going around this. This framing can create space. It doesn't create outcomes necessarily. It creates space for different conversations. Marquita, let me jump to you and any reactions to what Jeanette just said and this whole notion of inclusive care rather than closed groups and some groups on the outside that we've experienced historically.
Absolutely. And, all of the frames that we're going to discuss today are so closely related. And so this idea that care is inclusive and care is collective it brings me back to something Jeanette landed on, that I'll just kind of double down on, is the importance of, in the framing, creating space so that conversation can happen around, or so that we don't ignore structural issues. So this move away from these individual experiences, individual family, individual sort of connections to like their economic status, and really moving to looking at these structural and systemic issues, and the framing allowing for the acknowledgement. I think this idea that advocates are often trying to overcome in framing these conversations is this assumption that every child, every family, everyone's experience is the same, and you have the same resources, you have the same access to those resources, and you're navigating the same barriers. And so I think this framing around inclusive care does open the doors for that conversation, that in fact, it's not the same. Everyone isn't working from the same starting point. They don't have access to all the same resources. And there are some systemic issues that are driving that. So I think it's such a deep connection between this framing around like inclusiveness of care and collective care. And again, continuing to go back to like not these individualized experiences, but thinking structurally and bringing in this kind of structural conversations and systems analysis.
Wow. Okay, that was fantastic, both of you. Tara, I want to continue this conversation with you, but I want to take a little pause and just let you say what you do at Brookings and what the Center on Economic Security and Opportunity does, so that people understand where you're coming from.
Sure. We are a U.S. social policy shop within the economic studies program at Brookings. So we're economists who focus on U.S. social policy. We used to be known as the Center on Children and Families, and a year or so ago broadened that to recognize that, again, these issues are really not unique to children and families, and you can't think of them in just one silo. So we think pretty broadly about a lot of issues that impact children and the broader U.S. Population.
Awesome. So we've talked about care as collective, and we've talked about care as inclusive. And as part of that conversation about care as inclusive, we started to get into systems, not just the individual behaviors and actions, or even small community, but a broader notion of inclusivity. And now I want to talk about care as expansive. So here's the core thought, just to relocate everybody in what Jess said. Moving away from the perception that questions about kids belong solely in the private sphere and are not actually a public concern. And we need to move in the direction of an understanding of kids as full members of society to whom our policies and institutions need to be responsive. So in that last conversation, Tara, we started to talk about structural issues. And when we use the word care, it can feel very interpersonal, like you care for people, right? But there's a role for institutions. This is just not about all of us feeling more inclusive and wrapping our arms around more people and feeling concerned and excited about more people. It's about how our policies and our institutions respond. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think when we bring children and care into the policy conversation, and I'm thinking here about both the federal and state and local policy levels, we often turn to things that we traditionally associate with kids, like schools, like
Yes,
childcare, like maybe something about access to college, but pre-K, Head Start, that kind of policy area.
Kids
And of course,
policy.
those are
Kids policy.
See, and of course, those
Which
are
goes
to
in
kids.
kind of a, yeah.
But I actually think a danger of doing that, aside from the fact that we're leaving out a bunch of stuff that's also important, is that then we load all of our hopes and dreams for what can happen with kids onto these very narrow set of policy areas. And so if you think about what we expect from the K-12 system, for example, to solve a very wide set of issues, some of which have to do with educating the children, but many don't. We're sort of shoehorning things that are really much bigger into this, very narrow set of policies that we've decided are kids' policies. So I would love to see us think more holistically, and I do think this framework points us in that direction. And then we can turn to other policy areas and say, how are each of these affecting kids and setting them up to succeed once they get into the K-12 system, as opposed to expecting something that we've already labeled as a child place to
So-
solve all the problems.
Yeah, can you be a little more granular for a second? Like, name a couple policies that are not in that little world called kids issues, but have a profound impact on kids' well-being and their prospects. That we ought to, when we think about care as expansive and kids being, influenced by everything that happens, name a couple of policies where you think, oh, we could be thinking about kids here and how this is important for kids.
Sure. There are a lot of them. I see cost of housing just popped up in the chat. That's certainly
Yes,
an
of
area.
course.
The tax code is one that I think about a lot. And it's increasingly important to think about kids in relation to the tax code, because we have been steadily dismantling our cash safety net over time. So we have expanded in terms of health insurance. We've done some expansions on food assistance, but for cash, we really don't provide monthly cash welfare checks of the sort that we used to in the 80s or earlier. And what has replaced that has been changes to the tax code that direct resources to low-income families, especially those with children. And when we have tax discussions, we talk about the child tax credit that has the word child in it. We know that has to do with children, but there are a lot of other parts of the tax code that also influence the resources that families have to make ends meet, to support their children in their development. And the reason I'm thinking about this a lot is that in 2025, there's likely to be a very significant conversation around taxes, because certain components of the 2017 Tax Act are expiring, and including the child tax credit. And so it's important for us to be mindful of that. Another area is Social Security. So if you look in the data, there are actually more children living in households receiving Social Security income than there are receiving TANF income, which is monthly cash welfare.
Wow.
So areas that we don't necessarily think about being support for kids do actually matter for kids. And so I think there's just many areas like that where resources are determining the opportunities that kids have to thrive.
Great. Thank you so much. Jeanette, quick, I see you taking your notes. Quick reactions to what Tara says about this notion of an expansive view of care rather than a crabbed, narrow view.
I'll say the work on the tax code strongly resonates. That's something that we've been leaning more into over the past few years. And we actually just had our Healthy Children and Families Summit earlier this week. I just came back from Detroit, and we heard from, we had a conversation about the tax code and children and families, and oftentimes, we don't analyze the tax policies based on race, but they have differential impacts on families who are Black and Latinx and people of color. Those families tend to be more dual earners with two incomes, and those families are taxed at higher rates than families who may have single earners and may have more of their resources from capital gains, and that impacts children and families. But at the end of going away from any specific policy, we're really focused on how do we support really long-term shifts so that the well-being of children and families is seen as a priority of our economic system, and not only based on families' contributions to economic growth and productivity. Right now, a
Amen.
lot of the conversation is we need to provide paid leave because it's going to boost our economy.
Yes, exactly.
Or we need to invest in children as future workers.
Yes,
How do we
exactly.
invest? Yeah. So
Gotcha. Great. Marquita, quick final thoughts.
Not a lot to add. Agree with everything that's been said. You know, I
Right.
think you could just sort of with a bow and say any issue that affects family economic security, you know, is important for children. But I think the point I would just add or make is the tendency in politics and in advocacy for folks who often want to separate the children from the family unit. And I think this idea that care is expansive and there are issues that may appear to just directly impact the adults that also have an impact on children. You can't sort of take care of children without taking care of the entire family.
Yeah, there are a lot of comments. The chat is really alive with comments on this, and I see lots of good questions, some of which we tried to wrap into this conversation. Yikes, we have like 5 minutes to go. I've been having this conversation for 30 years. The notion that we're going to get anywhere in an hour is making my head explode. But just to all of you, Marquita and Jeanette and Tara, thank you so much. Your comments really helped helped us to understand both the basic ideas and the applicability of those ideas and why they might have power. Plus to what Jeanette said. This is not a messaging campaign. This is not a bumper sticker. This is not going to change how people behave in a very short term. This is a big idea that will unfold over time, and we hope redirect energy. There's lots of good energy about kids, but it's narrow, and we want to broaden that stream, and we think that this framing has the potential to do that. So thank you to each of you. And now I'm going to turn it back to David for a couple of quick observations and reflections, and then Tara, we will get Jess back to close us out. So David?
Great. I want to make one comment on what seems to be the top ranked question in the Q&A, which is about the use of the term collective care.
Yes.
And to be clear, and Jess can comment on this also, we are not recommending that that's something that you start your conversations with. That, you know, we're not saying that you should go out and talk about collective care. We are suggesting, however, that whatever your issue, and what's exciting about this is that you can frame whatever you care about in terms of supporting kids and families as a care issue. And not only a care issue, but a care issue that we are all both responsible for and can add to. So that's about collective care. But I wanted to make one other comment, which is, although we act like you know, this is something that just sort of came to us, we tried a lot of things to see if we could move public thinking around kids. And this was not a frame that, as somebody who's been in the advocacy space, came naturally to me. And I suspect it may feel like it's a little bit of a too little move to some people who want to be out there sort of shaking the windows and screaming louder. But it turns out that talking about care is a very, very potent way to open space in the public conversation. And all the things that we tried that I thought might be more powerful, and we tried a lot of them. I jokingly say that the more I was excited about something that we were going to try, the worse it did with the public. But this notion of care really resonates with people, and it resonates with people across a broad range of diversities. So it resounded among people across political lines, it resounded with people along ethnic lines, racial lines. And it's something that we didn't really get into the details about how you use this frame, and that's for another time. But you can apply this thinking, this kind of framing to whatever issue you care about, because every issue is a kid's issue and every kid's issue is about care. And that's really the take-home message for all of this. So we are just starting what will be a decade's worth of work of trying to get the field to reframe our messaging in terms of care. And part of that is making this work available to the field so that, it's certainly available online. I am also available as a resource, and I'll ask Erin to put my email up again. If you have questions about this work, would like to talk to me, would like a presentation to your organization about this work, please reach out to me and we'll see what we can arrange. But I could not be more excited about the possibilities that this work opens up for kids and their families, and really excited about the work ahead to bring this out into the public sphere. And I cannot be more grateful to the researchers, the social scientists, the frameworks to getting us here. So I will turn this back over to Jess and let her have a final word also.
Thanks, David. I'll just reiterate what you said about that phrase, collective caregiving, just because that was the top ranked question. Just to be really clear, that's the label we've given the strategy. It's not a magic phrase. It's not even language that we're suggesting you use explicitly. There are lots of different words and phrases that can help kind of bring this strategy to life. So yeah, feel free to not use those specific words, use your own words, put it in your own context. I've appreciated this conversation so much. I want to just say a really heartfelt thank you to all of our panelists, to all of the folks working behind the scenes, all of my colleagues at Frameworks, all of you for joining. I really think it's conversations like these that bring the strategy to life, that help us figure out how it's relevant, how it can actually be used, how we flex it to serve our purposes and to serve this shared vision of social change that we share. So thank you so much. You will receive an email with a follow-up, all the links to the resources that we've mentioned on this call, a recording. And like we put into the chat, we've created some toolkits that actually help you implement the strategy in your own communications in really concrete ways. The toolkits have sample communications and checklists and guides for particular messenger groups. So keep an eye out for those things. And then just thank you so much. Keep the conversation going and please stay in touch. Enjoy the weekend, everyone.